Our speaker this evening is our own Bob Scott, co-founder of Sarum Seminar, which I believe has now been running for 26 years. Am I right about that?
Beats me.
Something like that, something like from 1995 on.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
That's there. Bob's talk is Medieval Crime and Punishment and its roles in the life and times of Jonathan Wilde. So it's all yours now, Bob, except to remind people to hold all their questions and comments for the Q&A, which will take place when Bob has finished his talk. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be back. I wish we were live. I really do. But the virus won't cooperate. So what I want to do, this talk is going to be a bit of a hybrid because I want to begin with an introduction to some basic information about crime and punishment during the medieval period as prelude to talking about the career of the notorious late 17th and early 18th century criminal Jonathan Wilde, who was an absolute scoundrel who plied the criminal trades in London in the early modern period. The reason I'm beginning by talking about the Middle Ages is because the practices that Wilde employed in his time while engaging in criminal activity were made possible by arrangements for dealing with crime that trace back to the medieval period. Now, I want to pause for a minute because some of you may wonder, how in the world did I ever get myself into the middle of this topic and why? You may know that in my past life, I taught courses in crime and deviant behavior to undergraduates and graduate seminars. And one of the things that I always found very interesting in studying crime was how people who were criminals practiced their trade. That is, who taught them how to be criminals? Where did they learn this? How did they ply their trade? What were the traps that got them in trouble with the law? How did they evade these, and so on? So it's sort of using the perspective of, let's say, a sociologist studying careers of professionals like lawyers or doctors or academics or educators or what have you. Only in this case, I'm applying it to the study of criminals. And in that regard, I learned a lot about different kinds of criminals and how they practice their trade. And in the course of that, I came across the story of Jonathan Wilde, who, if there were a hall of fame for scoundrels, he would belong in it, and a place of privilege. He was an absolutely extraordinary person. So I shared this with Evelyn, this interest, and she said, you know, I think if you can make some kind of gesture toward the Middle Ages, people in the seminar might really be interested in what you have to say. So that's what I'm going to try to do and why I'm calling this a hybrid. So let me start with a few obvious observations about crime during the medieval period. The first point about it is that it was, of course, ubiquitous. Crime was out and about and everywhere, and it ranged from the very serious to the moderately serious to minor offenses. So murder was very common during this period: grand theft, high treason, heresy, arson, rebellion, assaulting or attacking royal officials. Any of those things qualified for as crimes, and they were considered to be the most serious. But then there were moderately serious ones that are kind of interesting, one of them being vagrancy. It turned out that in many communities, if it was actually against the law to be homeless, and if you were homeless, you were run out of town and sent off into the hinterlands. But then there was the problem of poaching, of witchcraft, of stealing crops, of hunting on royal lands, harvesting wood from royal forests, and that sort of thing, all the way down to the relatively minor offenses, such as gossiping, which was a serious problem in small villages, not working hard, cheating on one's spouse, drunk and disorderly conduct, petty theft, not attending church services, and so on. All of this had to be dealt with. Now, the punishment for this array of crimes was quite varied, as I'll try to explain in a moment. But in the end, it really all boiled down to one strategy, and that was severe deterrence. The idea was to deal with the crime in such a way that it was a highly public event that would discourage anybody from engaging in criminality themselves. At the time, there were things that I guess we would call jails, but they weren't used in the way in which we use them today. They were basically places where you sent people accused of crime to await trial, but they weren't punishment for if you were guilty. You were not sentenced to spend time in jail. It was simply a holding operation until you could eventually be brought to some kind of court or trial, and I'll explain what that's about in a minute. And then the other point about it is that law enforcement, as we think of it today, was really basically non-existent, or it was feckless. So you have this assortment of public officials, constables, people who were called peace officers of the crown. These are individuals appointed by the crown to enforce law violations affecting the crown. There were the so-called beadles. These were local officials for policing minor crimes. There were watchmen, there were sheriffs, even occasional private security forces. But all of these things, there was no organization to it. These figures were few and far between, and therefore it amounted to nothing more than a kind of hodgepodge of feckless entities. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why there was such a heavy reliance on deterrence as one of the few effective ways of controlling this. It's also important to remember that during this period of time, there wasn't anything like a municipal police force. You may have heard of the Bow Street Runners. They were first formed in London in 1749. Robert Peel's famous Bobbies were not organized until the middle of the 19th century. So if you were the victim of a crime, there were no police forces to summon. And so in the place of that, there were a variety of ways of dealing with crime. Vigilante groups certainly formed, and when people had committed crimes in local areas and there was no help to be summoned, citizen groups would get together and basically enforce the punishment. And it was always very harsh, usually extreme mutilation or hanging or something of that sort. But absent the vigilante groups, or in addition to the vigilante groups, there were three different kinds of courts. There were what were called Menorial Courts, and these were basically, this is the lowest form of court. As the name suggests, it was the lord of the manor who would create a court to enforce law violations or rule violations within the context of the manor. He would appoint an official. These courts were convened multiple times every year. It was mandatory in most cases that villagers attended. They would appoint a jury. And unlike today, the job of the jury was to hear the evidence and basically to make a decision about what the charges would be, whether guilt or innocence was the case, and if it was, then they would mete out the punishment. And it was pretty harsh unless it was a relatively minor offense. And it typically involved, most often would involve hanging or mutilation. Then there were the King's Courts, and the King's Court was created to deal with offenses against the crown. This might involve assaulting a royal official, attempted murder, treason, and poaching on the king's property and the like. And these courts also met several times each year. And like the Menorial Courts, the punishments, if you were found guilty, were extremely harsh. Again, hanging was quite common, flogging, public humiliations with extreme physical punishment associated with them. They were really pretty harsh. And then finally, there were the church courts, and these were presided over by the local bishop. And what set them apart is that these courts were notoriously lenient. They almost, except in the case of heresy, they almost never invoked the death penalty or even mutilation. More often, they demanded penance, they demanded payment of fines to the bishop. Sometimes people would be sent on pilgrimage. And this is really an important point, because if it were possible to have your case tried before a church court, you were much less, you were not going to be dealt with nearly as severely. And you'll see why that is such an important part of what happened with Jonathan Wilde. Now, the other feature of courts that's quite remarkable is the presumption is if you were accused of a crime, you were guilty and you had to prove your own innocence. So it's not like our system where you're assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. So the task of a jury or the presider of a court was basically to listen to whatever evidence you as the accused could adduce and make a decision as to whether you were guilty or not. Now, it wasn't always possible to come to a clear decision. And because of that, that is where trial by ordeal comes in. Because the idea here was that the person who knows, the entity who knows the truth of whether you're guilty or innocent was God. And so the question was, what could you do to the accused to try to reveal God's judgment? And that's what these trials by ordeal were all about. They were a way of testing whether the accused was innocent or guilty in the eyes of God. Now, these took various forms, none of them very pleasant. There were, for example, ordeals by fire, where you were handed a red-hot poker and made to walk a distance of, say, 9 feet, something like that. And then you would have wounds, and they would bind your wounds, and after a few days, uncover them. And if it turned out that they began to heal, that was seen as evidence that you were innocent and you were set free. And if they didn't heal, then you were dealt with very severely. Or they'd ask you to walk across beds of red hot burning embers. And so those were the ordeals by fire. In the case of water, what they did was one of two things. One is they would bind your hands and feet and throw you into a pond. And if you sank, you were guilty. And if you floated, you were innocent. And that was basically saying this is revealing God's will. Or with hot water, they'd have a cauldron of boiling water. They'd put a stone in the bottom. You'd reach in, grab the stone, pick it out. of course, get wounds as a result of that. They'd bind them, look at them a few days later. If they were healing, you were off free, and if they weren't, you were judged guilty. Now, with that as background, we then come to two specific sets of procedures or practices that arose in an effort to try to cope with crime that has a direct bearing on Jonathan Wilde's later criminal enterprise. One was benefit of clergy. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. And when it was first established, it was intended to be employed in cases in which priests and other church officials had been accused of crime, no matter how serious. And the idea was basically that if you were a member of the clergy, the proper jurisdiction for trying your case would be in the bishop's court. But in order for that to happen, you had to demonstrate that you qualified as a member of clergy and therefore would be granted this benefit of clergy. And if it was granted, it removed you from jurisdiction of secular courts. And of course, the great advantage of that was that the punishments were much less harsh and punitive. Now, that practice of benefit of clergy has a long history that goes far back to the time when crowns and churches really became firmly established in the Western world. But for our purposes, the most significant development took place in the 12th century, and it took place in connection with the assassination of Thomas Becket. Now, at that time and before, these two great institutions, the church and the crown, were in unending conflict with one another over over who had jurisdiction over crimes that were committed that may have affected either or both bodies. And that dispute was really not going anywhere. It was not in any way resolved. It was just a bone of contention. And it began to get resolved when, with the assassination of Becket by Henry II, because what Becket was arguing as one of the issues that led to the conflict between them was that if you were a member of clergy, you should be absolved from being tried in a crown court. And the argument that was used, it turns out, is surprisingly modern. The argument is clergy were people of high standing in the community, and the fact that they'd been accused of a crime or suspected of a crime was punishment enough. They lost face, they lost standing in the community, and that is exactly the argument that lawyers for white-collar criminals today use. That's the argument that when it comes to punishment, they basically say go light on them because they've suffered this loss of reputation and so on. So that was Becket's argument. But it wasn't going anywhere until he was assassinated. And then there was this public outcry against the king for the fact that he was seen to have instructed 4 knights to off Becket, and it was outrage, and he was forced to seek amends from the church. And this took place the assassination took place in 1170, and this took place at a confab that was held at the cathedral at Avranches. And he was told, Henry II was told he could purge himself of any guilt, provided he permitted this benefit of clergy to be granted wholesale to the church. And he acceded to that. And so that really gave the church an upper hand. Now, the story of what then unfolded is really is kind of ridiculous, because when it was first introduced, if you were a member of clergy and accused of a crime, you could go into a court, but you had to be tonsured, you had to be in ecclesiastical outfit to demonstrate the fact that you were actually an authentic member of the clergy. But over time, that got to be too cumbersome. And so they said, well, wait a minute, clergy are people who are literate, they can read. So all we have to do is give them a reading test, in effect. And if we do that and they pass that test, that's evidence that they must be eligible to plead benefit of clergy. They were among the few classes of citizens who were able to read. Well, once that happened, then it opened the door to all sorts of corruption, because it turned out there were other classes of people who could read. And if they could read, they were granted benefit of clergy, whether they were clergy or not. In addition, all kinds of loopholes started to develop. So there was a biblical passage that was traditionally used to administer the literacy test. It was the first verse of Psalm 51, which read, "O God, have mercy upon me according to thine heartfelt mercifulness." If you could read that, then they grant you benefit of clergy. But all that an illiterate person had to do was memorize it and recite that in front of someone appointed by the court who was literate. And if you got it right, they'd say, yeah, okay, you qualify, and they transfer it to a bishop's court. And for that reason, this Psalm 51 verse 1 became known as the neck verse. And it was called the neck verse because basically it was saving your neck from being hanged. Now, with time, this even got more watered down. By the time you get to the reign of Edward III in 1327, it was the reading of the neck verse didn't even have to be accurate. If you got it more or less right, you passed the test. And in one case, the accused was declared able to read simply because he identified the letters of the alphabet in the words, even though he couldn't recite the words. So it just really became subject to corruption. Priests, meantime, found this to be a steady source of income, because what you could do is go to a priest who would attest that you could read in exchange for a bribe, and they would go and go before the court and say they qualify, and so there it went. And this, even though this remained a bone of contention because of the assassination of Becket, the church got the upper hand, and it put in place this practice, which, as I'll try to show, Jonathan Wilde later on was able to capitalize on to gain control of criminality in London. The other development was the right of sanctuary, and that's pretty straightforward. If you were accused of a crime and you basically could make your way to any property that was considered to be sacred property, it could be a church, but it could be a churchyard, it could be territory around the church. If you got there, you were home free, because secular officials were prohibited from going in and arresting you, seizing you, and bringing you to other courts. And you'll see how that played into what Jonathan Wilde did eventually. Okay, so with that now as a lengthy background, let's get to Jonathan Wilde. He plied the criminal trades in London between 1704 and May the 24th, 1725. And why that exact date? Because that was the date that he was hanged. And his claim to notoriety is that he managed to operate on and control both sides of the law. He had a public persona as being a civic-minded crime fighter with a remarkable record for bringing thieves to justice and helping victims of crime recover their stolen goods. And he became renowned and citywide fame. He achieved citywide fame as this kind of miraculous agent of law enforcement. And the reason he was able to do it is because, unbeknownst to the public at large, he also controlled and actually operated the London's criminal underworld. So the people causing the crimes he was policing were working for him. And as you'll see, he worked both sides of it to his benefit. He became, he gained the title of Thief Taker General, and I'll explain what that's about in just a minute. But at the same time, he was head of and completely controlled all the major criminal gangs that existed in London. Now, a word or two about Wilde. He was born in 1682 in the West Midlands village of Wolverhampton, and that at the time was a small settlement 100 or so miles north and west of London. It was a center which had a lot of tanneries in it, and his first forays into employment were being apprenticed to tanners, all of whom fired him, brought him to court because he was stealing their money. And it became very clear to him it was a small village. If he hung around there, he was certain to end up in the gallows because he had been arrested and brought to justice 2 or 3 times. And so at the age of 26 in 1708, he set out for London. And even here, he was a scoundrel because what he did, he was born with a congenital hip deformity that made it possible for him to deliberately dislocate his hip at will, and then he could relocate it by jiggling his backside. And he hooked up with a snake oil salesman who was going from village to village selling an elixir. And Jonathan Wilde, when these shows would begin, would stand on the edge of the crowd, dislocate his hip. Sooner or later, the snake oil salesman would invite anybody to come up and try this, and Jonathan Wilde would make his way up, obviously limping. He'd take the elixir, either drink it or rub it on his hip or whatever. Then he'd shake his frame and relocate his hip, and it looked like a miracle was being performed. And that's the way he earned a living, getting from Wolverhampton to London. Once he got to London, which was now in 1708, he kind of disappeared from sight for about 2 years. There's no public record of what he was up to, except in 1710, when he was arrested for debt, and he was sent to what was called a compter. A compter was a small jail controlled by a local sheriff. At this time, jailing had now come into fashion. And he went to this compter. It was called the Wood Street Compter. And these places were notoriously corrupt. Basically, they were places where petty thieves, debtors, political dissenters, people guilty of public disorder, they were sent to these compters. And in order to get anything at all, the jailers were bribing anybody who was committed there, and they had to come up with their own resources to be fed, to be housed, and so on. And for most people, this was a horrible place to be sent. But for Jonathan Wilde, it was like a finishing school because it provided him with an opportunity to learn about crime in a way that he might not have been able to learn about any other way. And he was so clever that he very quickly gained the confidence of the sheriff who controlled this compter and became his personal aide. And over time, Wilde was actually able to extort minor payments from fellow prisoners for whatever amenities the sheriff allowed Wilde to control. Over time, the sheriff's task was to basically try to recruit new residents for his compter. And so he granted Wilde what was called the liberty of the gate. And this allowed him to go out at night and track down criminals and their whereabouts, and then come back and report it to the sheriff, who would then go and get them, arrest them, have them committed to the compter, and then exploit them in that way. And it was while he was doing this that he ran into a woman whose name was Mary Milliner. And Mary Milliner was a prostitute who worked her trade out of Soho in a house of prostitution. At the time, houses of prostitution were known euphemistically in London as vaulting academies. She took him under wing and began tutoring him in the finer points in the practice of crime. And this, in turn, made it possible for him to meet many members of the London criminal underworld that he would ultimately control. Okay, so in 1712, he managed to accumulate enough money to be able to buy his way out of the Wood Street compter. And he immediately contacted Mary Milliner. She hired him to be basically her tough, whose job it was to protect her and other prostitutes from harm on the street as they walked the streets at night. And it was in that capacity that she also began to introduce him to other elements of the criminal underworld in London. And that laid the groundwork for his eventual career as a fence for the return of items of property that they had stolen. Now, a word or two about London at that time. It was, of course, a horribly unsanitary place with raw sewage in the streets and disease and so on. You know all that. But the other feature of it was that it was crime was endemic. The population of London at the time was estimated to be about 660,000 people. They lived primarily in the city of London and the boroughs of Westminster, but also in neighboring villages like Chelsea, Kensington, Hampstead, Islington, Bow, Stepney, and Camberwell. And in addition, scattered through all of this maze of villages were what were called liberties. And this is where the right of sanctuary becomes so relevant, because these were enclaves of criminals who basically sought out what was regarded as a sacred space, and they camped there. And and ultimately, that's where the criminals were all concentrated. There were estimated to be something like 12,000 thieves practicing their trade in London at the time, and almost all of them lived in one or another of these liberties. So crime was a big problem. It was being reported every day in newspapers. It was costing the government an absolute fortune because they were trying to ship valuables by mail, and the thieves were holding up the stagecoaches that were carrying currency and so on, and the government was bleeding money because of this. And as I said, you know, the forces of law and order were simply not up to it. The result of that was that if you were a victim of crime, it was up to you basically to try to see that justice was done. You had to do the investigation. You had to try to track down the thief. Then you'd try to get a constable or a sheriff or someone to go and arrest them. You had to take them to court. And this proved to be impossible for ordinary citizens. And it was compounded by the fact that so many of these thieves had learned about the advantage of pleading benefit of clergy. And so even if you track them down, they might very well end up under the jurisdiction of a church court and you'd lose the case, or the punishment would be minor. And so this combination of no police force, no criminal justice system to speak of, coupled with benefit of clergy and the right of sanctuary, created an opportunity for a new kind of profession to emerge. And that's what thief taking was. It created an opportunity for people who wanted to be bothered by it to basically announce their willingness to try to locate the stolen property, bring the thief to justice, and hopefully have the property returned. And so this new career emerged called thief taker. As I say, Jonathan Wilde became known as the thief taker general. And as if this wasn't, these circumstances sort of came together to create an opportunity for Wilde to begin to exploit it, but it was compounded by an additional provision because crime was so rampant in the city that the Privy Council, local governing bodies were worried about how in the world can we police this? And the answer, it turned out, was to offer substantial rewards for anyone who could bring a thief to justice. And the reward was pretty generous. It came to something like 40 pounds in currency of the day, which is about the equivalent of 2,500 pounds in modern currency. So that was the circumstance under which of London when Wilde entered, was released from the Wood Street Compter. So he set out to try to capitalize on this. And the first thing he had to do was to wipe out the competition and gain control of the criminal gangs. At the time, there were 4 such gangs, 4 major gangs, and they were responsible for the overwhelming majority of properties of theft that were taking place at the time. And he eliminated them systematically by a very simple technique. If you were the head of one of these gangs and you had all these thieves working for you, they were instructed to basically report to you anything they had stolen, turn the property over to you, and you would then be make an effort to fence it and share the profits with the thief. But in order for that to happen, they had to have warehouses where they stored it, and it was the bosses themselves who took possession of the stolen property. Well, Wilde figured this out, and he said, all I have to do is turn them in and know where they're storing this stuff, and they're going to get hanged. And that's exactly what happened. He eliminated the heads of these 4 gangs very, very quickly because they were in possession of all this stolen property. He then lined up the thieves who worked for them and basically said, I want you to work for me. And if they agreed, he had an arrangement, which I'll explain in a minute. And if they didn't agree, he would turn them in for the reward money and they would be hanged. So that's how he controlled them. And he ended up basically gaining complete control over the whole criminal underworld of London by systematically eliminating the competition. And he was lining his coffers because he kept turning in, if there were thieves who wouldn't work for him, or if there were thieves who sort of, his sense was these are people who have basically run the course, he would turn them in. He was cashing them in for the reward money and then using it to fund his enterprise. So he eliminated all of these competitive gangs and recruited the thieves, this army of thieves, to work for him. But what he would do is, if you worked for him and stole something, you needed to go to him and tell him where you stole it, when you stole it, how you stole it, what it was, what its likely value would be. But he would never himself take possession of the goods. So Wilde himself could never be charged with possession of stolen property. He then set up this network of warehouses all over the city where his name could not be traced to those warehouses, but he would tell these thieves, take it and deposit it there. And I will then make an effort to, in effect, fence it. And so that's how the enterprise was working. So now he knew about what had been stolen and the circumstance of it. It's sort of think of it as he knew the biography of the act of theft. And then to fence it, what he did was to try to somehow get the attention of the person whose property had been stolen, saying that he, in the course of being thief taker general of London, had learned about this property and perhaps it's yours, would you come and take a look at it? And he'd have it delivered to his office. And if it was that person's, they would pay him a reward for having done it. And then he'd share a portion of that with the thieves and embellish his own coffers. And he used a variety of techniques to try to catch the attention of victims of crime. He put ads in paper saying, in the course of trying to bring thieves to justice, it's come to my attention that there's an article of a certain type, and he would describe it in detail in entries in newspapers so that people could identify what the object was and knew that he had access to it. And then they would go to him and he would arrange what I'm calling the fencing operation. And as a result of this, he gained enormous visibility as a very successful thief taker. He was the guy you would go to if somebody stole your property. And he had this remarkable record of being able to return it without people realizing that the reason he was able to do that is that the thieves who stole it were working for him and they were telling him the details of the theft. He became a public celebrity, and he was frequently consulted about what to do about crime waves that he himself was causing. And what he always told Parliament and others is, well, you've got to increase the generosity of the reward. That's the only way out of this. And of course, that was benefiting him because he was cashing in people who weren't working out for him. Or he would engage occasionally in blackmail, because if a gentleman were to go to one of these vaulting academies and have property stolen, he would then get in touch with him and say, this come to my attention. I know I have in my possession a watch, a valuable watch, and I can arrange to have it returned to you, but I know something of the circumstance of where it was stolen, and the person's reputation was then compromised, and so it went. Now, he, at the height of his career, he set up an office. It was called the Office for the Recovery of Lost and Stolen Property. And it was located in a very prestigious neighborhood in the city of London, opulently furnished. That's where people would go to see if he had any word of what had been stolen. And of course, he always did, because he knew exactly what was stolen and who took it and where it was. And so you can see how every part of this whole operation that he had was dovetailing with every other piece of it in a very, very successful way. I should add that one of the things he did was he had a small army of priests who worked for him, who would be prepared to attest that any criminal brought to court could plead benefit of clergy and get off with mere penance or whatever. So he was working all of this, relying on the existence of these liberties and this ability to make that plea. So in the end, he was done in, as you might expect, because he was employing this whole army of thieves, and there was no honor among them, and they figured out what he was doing, and eventually they brought him to justice. They were able to figure out that he was the one who owned the warehouses to which they were delivering the goods. And he was brought to court and sentenced to hang at Tyburn Prison in May of 1725. Now, that's not the end of the story, because after he was hanged, his body was buried in St. Pancras Old Church in London. But then the College of Surgeons was on the lookout for corpses to do for dissection. And they exhumed his body and sold it to, I don't know who did this exactly, but it was sold to the College of Surgeons, who then proceeded to dissect it. And it turns out that the only thing that remains of his body is his skeleton. And the skeleton can be found in a museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields called the Hunterian Museum. And so if you go there, you can see it. I haven't ever been able to do that, but that's high on my list if I ever get back to London. Now, just a final note. It happened that when I was working this whole talk up, I discovered an article that appeared in the New York Times of April the 26th, 2021, that reeks of what Wilde had been doing. And it was an article about what's called the reputation business. It was an investigation undertaken by 2 Times reporters into learning who is responsible for and profiting from the growing system of websites whose primary purpose is to destroy your reputation. And here's what they discovered. One of the authors, his name is Aaron Krolik, deliberately wrote a very nasty post about himself, and he put it up online, and then he watched as this thing metastasized, and it went all over the internet. And he sooner or later discovered that he was contacted by a company that claimed to be reputation managers. And they asked for a fee of $20,000 to eradicate this material from the internet and restore his reputation. And what he was able to learn is that the company, the reputation managers, were the ones who were spreading the false rumors about him. So it's it's another version of Jonathan Wilde. So that's the story of this guy. You have to almost admire him, but he was a scoundrel like few others I ever encountered. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this or refer you to any sources, including Daniel Defoe's work on who wrote extensively about Jonathan Wilde. But there you are. Questions? I hear the sound of one hand clapping.
Yeah, I see Virginia has a question. So her
Yeah.
She has to mute herself.
Yeah. Anyone?
There's a lot of questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This sounds an awful lot like the Three Penny Opera. Is there any relationship?
About yes, there is. It was basically inspired by Jonathan Wilde. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. I tried to track that down in more detail and wanted to build it into this talk, but I kind of ran out of time, so I wasn't able to do it. But I do know that it was inspired by that.
My question
Yeah.
is, this whole story gives me a lot of insight into the understanding Sykes and Fagin in Oliver Twist.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They were basically modeling themselves after what Jonathan Wilde did.
Linda Papanicolo has a question?
Yeah,
That was the one I just asked.
That's the one she just asked.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Virginia.
Okay, you mentioned there were 3 types of courts, the
Yeah.
manorial, the kings, and the church.
That's
What
right.
about in cities?
Well,
There must have been city courts.
I'm not, yes, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, so I won't try to answer it.
Okay.
But in reading the literature that I've read to for this talk, the only 3 that they mentioned were those 3. Now, of course, the crown courts would have been in cities, or many of them would have been in cities, but there must have been courts that developed in municipalities.
Particularly free cities.
Yeah, that's right. But the key thing was severe punishment. So you wanted to make your way to a church court. And if you could do that, you were basically home free.
And how did the crook, who maybe was arrested for some infraction against the king, the crown, how could that crook then get moved over to the church jurisdiction? Was it only because of citing this psalm verse?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it was really a messy and contentious process in which the king was trying to claim jurisdiction, and so was the bishop, and they were at each other's throats. But if you could somehow get yourself under the jurisdiction of the church court, you would be much better off. Yeah.
Charlotte, do you have a question?
I did. Bob, I'm thinking about the literacy test
Yeah.
for the church. And I'm assuming, you didn't say this, but I'm guessing that part of the negotiation there was a commitment on the part of the plaintiff to make the church look good, did they agree to pray? I mean, was there a transaction that happened?
Well, yeah,
I would.
Two things happened. One is money changed hands. That was the main thing. But the other is that it would be punishment handed down by the church in the form of penance sometimes sentencing people to go on pilgrimage. The sort of the usual way that the church was trying to handle sin. Now, partly it's hard to fill in a lot of the details because this topic has not been as fully researched as one might like. And so what I'm reporting is what I've been able to read about it, but there's not anything like the historical studies that would kind of flesh out some of the answers to these questions. Yeah. Yeah.
John Wilkes?
Thanks. Yeah, great talk, Bob. A couple of questions about the benefit of clergy, right? You sort of described it as a male thing. Did it apply to women as well?
Yes, it did. The nuns eventually.
Yeah.
But the other point, I should have mentioned this, the other point was it started out being applied exclusively to male clergy, but then it got extended to nuns, then it got extended to grave diggers, sextons, anybody who could claim any kind of affiliation with the church in any capacity or way of employment was able to make that claim. So that's part of the way in which this thing just got ridiculously watered down. Yeah.
And then the follow-on question is sort of how did it end, and how do these liberties get eventually eradicated?
Oh,
as well as the benefit of clergy?
I don't know the answer to that, but those enclaves did exist. And I think probably it was with the development of an organized police force in large cities that they were able to begin to rein in the thieving that was taking place, because all of these crimes were crimes against property. That's what you wanted. You didn't want to kill somebody. If you had to, you would, but in connection with stealing something. But it was crimes against property because that's where the money was. You'd get it fenced and so on. And I think that probably it was the emergence of a strong state and the emergence of the Bow Street Runners and Bobbies and so on that really made it more and more difficult for these thief takers. And Jonathan Wilde didn't help, because once it became known what he was up to, that basically curtailed the ability of other criminals to engage in the same activity.
Corky, you have your hand up?
I had a question about the liberties as well, actually. I thought that was great, Bob, and somebody needs to make a movie about Jonathan.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
On the liberties, I think the other courts, if you were in a county like Derbyshire, you had the county court in Derby, and then there's like 600 or 700, and each of them had 100 court.
Oh, yes.
And if those, you'd pay tax and you'd have certain payments due. And as I understand it, the liberties go way back to like 8th and 9th centuries, where a church didn't have to pay its taxes or fees.
Oh, yeah.
And so they had a liberty.
Yeah.
And it was a liberty from payments. But I was interested. I'd never heard a parallel between them becoming places where the criminals lived. Do you recall any named places in London?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't come across. They simply, the reference that I got from it was the proliferation of these liberties that were interwoven among the various villages, and they were always surrounded by church property. So,
Fascinating.
Linda Jack, hi. Question?
Hi, that was really fun, Bob. I couldn't quite track, so maybe you know. From the time he actually got to London to the time he was hanged, how long was his career?
Yeah, It was, I think, well, the exact dates. Just hang on for a minute, because he got to London, I think, in 1708. In 1710, he was committed to the Wood Street Compter. He was released in 1712, and he was hanged in, what did I say the date was?
25.
May the 25th of, just a minute.
1725, you said.
1725. So it's basically the first quarter of the 18th century when he was in his heyday.
Oh, he had a better than a decade of
Yeah,
free to roam about.
yeah, exactly. No, he really did. And he made a fortune. I mean, he was very wealthy, and used that wealth very cleverly to promote his own celebrity, sort of an early version of Kim Kardashian or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't help laughing all the way through your talk because it was so funny.
But something I want to mention is the first book I read about this was brought to my attention by a good friend of mine who is a professor of sociology at London School of Economics. His name is Paul Rock. And he read this book and he said, oh, you've got to read this thing. It's called Thief Taker General. And it's written by Gerald Howson. And I read this thing, and this book was really opened my eyes. It basically laid out the story that I've been telling you. And I thought at one point, I said to Paul, you know, we should really track down Gerald Howson just to meet him, because it's such a great book. And so we did. And lo and behold, he is a photographer who's an amateur historian. And he did this kind of on weekends and at nights. He pieced the whole story together. And I mean, I'd give my right arm to have written a book like that. And this guy was just doing it on, on the side. But it's a marvelous book. It's really very, very good, very detailed and carefully researched. Yeah.
Bob Nyden, have you more?
I was
Yes.
just oh, sorry.
Oh.
I misheard that. Go ahead.
I was just going to go tell you a little bit about the extra parochial areas, the liberties.
Yeah,
there are still at least two liberties in London, the Inner and Middle Temple.
Right.
And according to Wikipedia, they describe themselves in letters patent from 1608.
Wow.
And retain a large degree of independence to the present day. They are extra parochial as well, not governed by the City of London Corporation.
Yeah.
And they're ecclesiastical. They're outside the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Bishop of London.
Wow.
I first heard about liberties when I was reading Patrick O'Brian novels.
Yeah.
Because one of the main characters very carefully has his abode in one of these liberties so that he cannot be taken to court. Although he actually turns out to be a spy for the government anyway. But anyway, aside from that, these things still exist.
Yeah, yeah.
Oops. So the master of the temple, master of the temple church, I should say, is appointed by the Queen. You know, I worked on the temple church. Choir, and so he was one of the leaders of the symposium, and I got to know him pretty well. I can't remember his name at this moment, but anyway, he was appointed by the Queen, so it's an extremely prestigious appointment.
Virginia, is that Tim has talked about ecclesiastical buildings that are, he calls them royal peculiars? Is that?
Yes, the royal peculiar.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh,
I have another question if nobody else does.
Yep.
Oh, well, I was curious about the municipal court question, so I quickly Googled it under britishhistory.ac.uk. Most of the city courts developed in the later Middle Ages.
Okay.
So there was a beginnings in the 13th century, but a lot of them happened in the 14th and particularly the 15th century.
Yeah.
And there ended up being Menorial Courts with a mayor and so on and so forth. So it gradually develops from the 13th to the 15th century and on.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to make a comment about the ordeal. It was my understanding that the ordeal was outlawed in the Lateran Council of 1215, although the practice, of course, continued. The legal document and practice are usually never the same.
13th century, it was, that's right, it was outlawed, that's right, yeah.
But it did exist for a while.
Yeah. The one piece of this that I can't get any clear picture of was the role that I'm calling them vigilantes might have played. Because in these small villages where you had people who were engaged in gossiping and drunkenness and so on, these are people who ended up being put in the stocks and had rotten fruit pelted at them and so on, really publicly humiliated. But I don't think that in every case it was the product of a sentence by a court. I think the local citizens basically were running people in and trying to deal with nuisances. Yeah.
Well, they would call for the hue and cry when they knew some crime had been committed.
Yeah.
And then the whole town was supposed to turn out like a volunteer fire department.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
This is another question just to see if we can prompt any more colorful stories. I just Googled Charles Hitchin and Jack Shepherd. I don't know whether you read about them, Bob. It looks like they were around at the time.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can tell us about them?
No.
Can you, Corky?
This is a perfect illustration of why I gave up teaching, because when I was teaching before, people couldn't access the internet in a classroom and check the veracity of what I was saying. And now they can, and I'm out of this business now. But thank you for that information. No, I don't know anything about that or I haven't come across anything about that.
I couldn't say anything more than a 2-minute Google on Wikipedia, but Jonathan seems not the only interesting character at the time. Charles Hitchin was the thief taker general before him and after him. There's a career that also ended. And Jack Shepherd was his competitor, apparently, in another gang. Yeah. So I'm just writing the movie. There's a lot of characters to put into it.
Yeah, you're not kidding. You're not kidding. It would make a fabulous movie. It really would.
The mafia is so blasé after this.
Yeah, you're not kidding. They're tame. Yeah.
Can you expand on the hue and cry, which was brought up earlier? Because I think that's a totally fun concept.
Yeah.
And is something that's still sort of relevant. I mean, morally and ethically today.
Yeah, good point.
I'm sure that got some people who were not deserving of it, but they caught also a lot of people who had committed breaches of the peace, especially thieves. If somebody's horse disappeared, they called the hue and cry, and all the townspeople would come out and try to find it.
Yeah.
And they did not necessarily treat the perpetrators kindly.
Kindly, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But that's rather old. I'm not sure when it began, but I know that was in early Middle Ages.
Yeah. that it?
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you,
Thank
Bob.
you for listening.
Thanks,
Bob.
Uh,
Oh, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for allowing me to indulge one of my personal interests and to somehow work it into a talk that I can give to a medieval seminar. So
It leaves me wanting more.
Well, you can
Well,
all
that-
start writing the novel now.
yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, thank you all for listening, and I think we'll call this to a close.